Are you ready for more color changing pigments? Well, here we are. Now, I already showed you how to do this with acrylics, but this time we're gonna do it with oils. Mixing color shifting pigments and acrylics is a little bit easier than oils. Oils have a bit of a process. However, I do think it's worth it. Oils can be very beautiful by nature, and oftentimes they tend to be inherently glossy, which lends itself very well to color shifting pigments. Now, I could just tell you to go dump a bunch of oil on some color shifting pigment and then mix it around a bunch, but we're actually going to do this the right way, and I'll explain the importance of that. And for the process, I'm going to do a quick and fun Among Us painting because the content fits. First, you're gonna need some materials. I highly recommend a glass palette. It's more durable than you think, extremely easy to clean and maintain, and it won't stain. Spend the extra couple bucks to get the ones with the rubber ends. That'll keep it from slipping or cracking on the edge of something. I also recommend a silicone blade or wedge to help you clean up your palette. Especially when you're mulling pigments, the stuff can get all over the place. This makes it a lot easier. Then you want to get an empty aluminum paint tube. You don't have to, you can stick it in a jar, but your paint's gonna last longer because this tends to be a little more airtight. And most importantly, you want a metal tube ringer. Don't get the plastic. Every painter should have one of these. It keeps you from wasting paint, and if you're mulling your own paint, it helps you to store that paint more securely. I'll have links to all this stuff below. So get your linseed oil. Can't have oil paints without oil. There are a lot of different brands out there, but you can use whatever fits your budget or whatever's most comfortable. You can use a refined linseed oil. There's nothing really wrong with that, but it is a little bit darker, which could potentially impact the color shifting pigment just a little bit, especially if it's something brighter. Then you need a palette knife. I always recommend metal. It holds up better, it scrapes and unloads paint a little bit better, and they tend to be easier to clean. For this, I prefer to use the flat end, and that's purely for picking up paint and sticking it in the tube. And then the silicone scraper. You can see I've used this quite a bit. It will stain over time. Try to keep it as clean as possible, but it's a really useful tool. It's not quite as effective with color changing pigments as it is traditional pigments when mulling paint to like scrape it off of the palette, but I'll explain why a little later. And then your little aluminum tube to store your paint. I'm actually not going to be making enough paint to really warrant the tube in this video, but this will at least show you how to do it. And then the all-important tube ringer. Try your best to keep your tube ringer clean. Mine is really dirty. You want to take care of your tools, because if you do, then they'll take care of you. How it works is you stick the end of a tube between the two clamps, and together they kind of move like a gear. It smashes the tube together and pushes all of the paint inside forward. That way you're not wasting any material, and you get a fairly airtight seal. And while you might think that this is a number of items that it is not, this is a paint muller. It's handmade and made out of glass. The bottom of it has a textured surface to help you grind down pigments. What's really important about this is you have a glass paint muller and a glass palette, and together they make a really consistent result. This is extremely durable. I can't tell you how many times I've dropped it. And I mean like drop it on the floor, not just drop it on my desk. I got this one from Etsy. I'll have that link below. Also get yourself one of these razor blades if you don't already have one. This one is completely dedicated to painting. It's got paint all caked in it. Again, clean your tools. Don't follow my example. I got a little lazy here and I'm kind of regretting it. Take the extra time to keep your tools clean. I can't stress that enough. Anyway, this makes cleanup a whole lot easier, and because you're using a glass palette, you can just run it along the bottom and scrape off all of that paint, whether it's wet or dry. I like to use Clorox wipes for the final wipe down, but if people are still hoarding them by the time you watch this, you can just use a rag and some rubbing alcohol and that should do the trick. Or at least it should loosen stuff up enough to where you can just scrape it off with the razor. And then the color shifting pigments. I'm just going to be using the ZTP and the ZGA in this video, but this process actually applies to any kind of pigment. It's a little difficult to tell that it is color changing pigment because the overhead light is really overwhelming, and because of that, it doesn't refract properly. So what does that even mean? Also, wear a mask of some kind as you're doing this, like until you get the pigment actually mixed into the oil and it's less likely to be airborne. We should all have a mask of some kind laying around at this point, so that shouldn't be too hard. Okay, so dump your pigment out into your palette. Be careful with this, don't make a mess. And I mean, look at it, it looks like nothing. You would have no idea that it color shifts in any way because the camera is static and the overhead light is really overwhelming and just right on top of it. Okay, this is where art meets science. Take a deep breath, it's not as complex as it's going to sound. So when you look at this pigment up close, you can see as I move the light around that the individual flakes change colors from purple to blue blue and back to purple again. This is where that light refraction comes in. So reflection happens when a light wave bounces off of a barrier and heads in a different direction. Refraction, on the other hand, is when that same wave gets absorbed into a barrier and then spit back out into another direction. The wave, in this case, being the light that I'm shining on the pigment. Each one of these flakes comes from a sheet of microscopic dielectric layers. When these layers are set at different thicknesses, they absorb different wavelengths of light and then refract what's left. So when you have a light that's overhead without an angle of incidence, which just means having the light off to the side so it can hit the pigment at an angle, you're not going to be able to see the resulting light refraction that's going to come out as a different color because those dielectric layers absorbed some of the light frequency. I said all of that crap just to say that you got to move around your light source in order to see the color changes. Alright, back to making paint. So you want to pour some of your linseed oil on top of the pigment. I actually want a very thin pigment for this. If you want to go thicker to add some extra shape and texture for whatever piece of art you're trying to make, then do that. That would actually be really cool with this type of paint. And then take your palette knife and roughly mix it together. All you're trying to do here is to get all of those particles kind of bound together. But simply using your palette knife to mix an oil paint really just isn't good enough. Can it work in a pinch? Yeah, but you really want to use the paint molar to properly press out the pigment. Start out with a small amount of oil. You can always add more, but you can't take it out. Because the flakes in this pigment are larger than traditional pigments, this is going to be kind of a crunchy paste for a little while. It's going to take a good amount of time to get it nice and smooth. So be patient with this and do it right. It's going to be a lot of moving your paint molar around, flattening and grinding the pigment as you see areas that look a little thick, probably a little chunky, and you want a nice smooth texture by the end of it. You want to use that silicone scraper to get all of that pigment kind of recentered so you can push it right back out again. The difference between the color shifting pigments and a traditional pigment is the way that the pigment adheres to the glass. So you'll need to take your palette knife behind the silicone scraper and get the rest of that pigment off of there, put it right in the center of the pigment, and then press it right back out. And you continue to do this until the consistency feels smooth, it's not slimy or goopy, and it feels like it'll be nice to paint with. Overall, this took me somewhere around 20 to 25 minutes to complete. And for the record, here is a quick example of how this silicone scraper works with a traditional pigment. Finally, I've got this stuff to a consistency that's really smooth and nice, so it's time to put it in the tube. Again, there's really not enough to kind of warrant a tube, but I'm just going to show you the process just in case you do happen to have enough pigment to put in a tube. My mixture is really fluid, so it's pretty simple, but if you have a thicker mixture, it might be a little more complicated not to get paint all over the places you do this. Use your palette knife to carefully scrape up your paint, and then do your best to drop that paint into the center of the tube. You're gonna get stuff on the sides, but try your hardest not to. Now and again, take your palette knife through the inside, kind of scrape off the sides and try to work that back into the middle and push it downward. You can also tap the tube on your desk or whatever surface you have, kind of work out some of the air and move your paint downward. It's important that you get that air moved out and that you get as much paint as possible off of the sides of the tube. You want it collected into one space towards the cap. And while everything is still nice and wet and easy to clean up, you want to clean up your palette and your tools completely. Get all of that pigment and all of that oil off of all of the surfaces. Now look into your tube of paint, find the very top of the paint, and squeeze the sides of the tube. You want to get as little air in the container as possible. So if a tiny bit squeezes out, that's okay. Obviously you don't want to lose all of your paint, but once you get the end of the tube flattened out pretty well, you want to stick it through your tube wringer, get it completely crimped so that there's no moving air, you're not going to have paint come out the back, and then label your paint so you know what it is. And then you're ready to go. And then I just repeated this process with the ZGA. And then finally, we get to play around with our paint. This is a pretty simple example of what can be done with this stuff, but you can really get creative with it. You can make it thicker with all kinds of textures. You can paint all types of cool concept art. Really, it's just up to you to get creative with it. I look forward to seeing more people use color shifting pigments. And if you want to see more weird and interesting art stuff, you're welcome to subscribe to the channel.